I'm Christian Chiller. Welcome to my podcast, an enthusiastic ramble through whatever has taken my interest the past week or so. Expect technology, games, history, travel, geekery, and as always, much, much more. Welcome to another Chinchilla Squeaks with me, Christian Chiller, and I am ploughing through the quite large backlog of KubeCon interviews from earlier this year. I actually did a lot of interviews, so it's going to take me a little while to get through them all. I tried to group together some of these interviews into themes, and I found two that fit together quite well this episode. I have Dinesh from CIVO, a European, UK-based hosting company, doing things a little bit differently from a lot of the cloud host companies, actually kind of going back to how hosting used to be back in the day of like 10 years ago. And then Thierry from the Open Infrastructure Foundation, talking about, I guess, the tools that companies like CIVO actually use. So there we go. That made sense to me to group them together. On the subject of KubeCon, I wanted to talk about MagicMind. I could have done with MagicMind there in those late nights, early mornings, windowless, stuffy halls, walking backwards and forwards, talking to lots of people, drinking a little bit too much, not eating so well. Could have done with that little bit of energy kick that MagicMind is giving me. I have also found that since last episode, I am sleeping much better. So possibly MagicMind is helping me there. Hard to say, but my energy levels have been pretty good. I've had a very productive week. Actually, despite it being very warm here, and Berlin does not do things like air conditioning, so you just have to struggle through that heat, which saps your energy, of course. So it's been helping me going. If you're interested, you can head on over to magicmind.com/chinchillasqueaks, name of the show, no spaces, 20, number 20. And that will get you a 48% discount on subscriptions and 20% on one-time purchases. And let me know how it works for you. With that done, let's get to the interviews. Dinesh from CIVO and Thierry from the Open Infrastructure Foundation. And I will talk to you at the end of those.
We are a public cloud provider, and we're challenging the status quo about what the public cloud is today.
Okay.
We kind of believe at the moment the public cloud is broken.
Okay.
It promised effortless scale, infinitely scalable, cost effective, but at the moment we think that it's really expensive.
Yeah.
It's really easy to get locked in to these providers, and you have no idea where you're spending the money, and it takes ages to come up. So,
Okay. It's a bold statement. It is quite true. How
are we doing it? How are we doing it? That's a really good question. So, firstly, we've built a public cloud from scratch, from the ground up. So we are in data centers around the world.
Okay.
We ship hardware that we own, servers, switches, routers, everything. We own the entire stack.
Yeah.
We do things like buying connectivity from tier one providers as well. So everything is under our control. We then, obviously being at KubeCon, we deploy Kubernetes to that hardware, and then we offer virtual Kubernetes clusters on top of that.
So what was the origin story here? And if it's okay to ask, how are you funding this? Because that sounds like a very expensive startup cost.
So we've been around for about 5 years now.
Okay.
It's all privately funded.
Okay.
We've been very fortunate to be able to do that and sort of organically grow.
Yeah.
This is probably the fifth venture that we are in of creating a startup, having it grow organically. One of the companies that Mark, our CEO, and I have been running was LCN in the UK, grew to be the fifth largest domain name registrar and virtual hosting company in the UK. So very similar to GoDaddy, if you've heard of them.
Yeah, I remember that I kind of moved away from them, but yes.
LCN or GoDaddy?
GoDaddy.
Yeah.
Because, I don't know.
Yeah.
And then every nerd loves Hover, so I just kind of ended up moving.
Yeah.
I don't have many domains anymore anyway, so it's less of a thing.
But yeah, that's kind of where our roots were. Along the way, we've built data centers, we've put fiber in the ground, building MPLS networks around the UK.
Yeah.
We've got a cybersecurity company as well, which is one of the fifth largest growing cybersecurity companies in the EU at the moment. And yeah, CIVO was getting us back to our hosting roots.
And is it mostly European based or?
For CIVO, no. CIVO is completely global.
Okay.
We started up being a completely remote first company as well. So got staff going from Malaysia, India, Bangladesh, Poland, Italy.
But interesting, I mean, I'm just picking on those locations because you mentioned them. Are you filling gaps in regions that some of the other providers don't have? Is that?
No, so that's where staff are. So
Okay.
our regions,
Our
regions are, we've got 2 in the United States, East and West Coast, 1 in London because we're, headquarters officially would be in the UK, and then 1 in Frankfurt when we needed to get something in the EU.
And how does one go about negotiating space in data centers? Like, I can imagine that can be hard, and there can probably be limited space available and things like that. Like, how do you do that when you are probably able to bargain less than some of these people you're trying to compete with as well?
So it's co-location is the service that is, and it's a really old service of renting space in data centers. We've been involved with it for building data centers and then renting that space out. So we were very aware of the market and what you need to be doing to get into that and everything. And there are thousands of data centers around the world that you can phone up and just say, I would like some space, please. And they will give you a price, and then it's a negotiation piece.
And so coming on that, how are you then, let's dig into some of those challenges, let's call them that, you set yourself.
Yeah.
How are you managing to, especially on the costs?
Yeah.
How do you do what you do?
So costs in other cloud providers are massively inflated at the moment. Take egress charges, data egress charges at the moment. I know at the price that I can buy transit across the internet, what some providers are charging as their list price is a 2,000% markup on that. So, and those are prices that I can buy as a relatively small provider. There are also these things called peering exchanges, where you don't actually pay for this traffic that's going across the internet. It's free because providers want to not pay for all of this. So you basically create a physical fiber between you and BT, and then any of that traffic going between you two is free. So these prices are massively inflated. We can offer what we do at the price that we do and still have enough money to run a company. And
is your pricing kind of the more contemporary, hours, megabytes, cycles, whatever, or is it like the more old school where it used to pay per month kind of thing, or both?
Yeah, so we're on a per hour basis of resources, and it equates down to the amount of RAM that you're using. So, if you've got 4 gigabytes VM or an 8 gigabytes, the 8 is twice as expensive as the 4. And we really want to be transparent about the pricing, because we've spoken to a lot of customers that at the end of the month, you have a finger in the air decision of whether or not your cloud bill is huge or small, and you then can't work out why it is in either direction.
I, for one, have a bunch of very small recurring bills with several cloud providers that every month I go, I'm going to figure what this is. And then I start digging and it's like, I can't be bothered. And then
you can't work out where it is. But, we want it to be that your price will change at the end of the month if you have made an active decision during the month.
Yeah.
So is that a scale up, a scale down, or a provision of a new service like object storage?
Yeah.
Cool. That is under your control, and you expect that change in price at the end of the month.
So coming to the simplicity, the ease of use, are you basically, he says in quote marks, just offering kind of a Kubernetes offering? So whatever Kubernetes offers is what you can get, or is there a bit more than that?
There's a little bit more than that. So there are a lot of options that you have to put in other providers. I feel like I'm always bashing other providers, but it's just a comparison that I know people will understand. So, spinning up an instance or a Kubernetes cluster, you've got lots and lots of options that you need to go to. And most of the time you are not changing them. You're just leaving them the default. Or if you are changing them, is because it's some sort of security requirement or very unique customization that you want. So on the security side, we do a lot of secure defaults out of the box. Take firewalling for an example. If you get a Kubernetes cluster and you want to open up management access, we give you the option of the current IP that you are connected to the service from, or everywhere. And those are the two options that you get. Because most of the time you're going to either be on a corporate VPN and want to lock it down, or it is an everywhere kind of thing. And there's obviously the button of leave me alone, I know what I'm doing, just allow everything from anywhere. But then we also understand it's mostly going to be a web service. So there's just a one-click button for 80 and 443 and off you go.
Okay.
So there is customization, but it's secure defaults, and most of the time we just let you run with it.
Okay. And for the portability aspect, I'm guessing again, because you're using kind of open source standards, it's relatively easy to move things around. The interesting question I'd actually want to ask is, bearing in mind your main competitors, is it how, like, actually, are there many other people like CIVO who I could go to and do a similar thing? Or
I think, there's been some interesting news recently about VMware and Broadcom and the price rises. And, I think it's really highlighted how few people are in this business of providing either cloud publicly, or what people want is an on-prem cloud as well, right? So very, very few people, very, very few that are mature as well that are out there. So no, there aren't many.
There are a couple, and most of the ones I know are in Europe, like I think like Hetzner,
Scaleway, OVH.
Yeah.
You've got the big three, DigitalOcean, CIVO, Oracle Cloud, maybe IBM, but there's 10 companies globally there that are doing this.
So the interesting question there would be is, when you talk about who you're trying to compete with, I think we're thinking of the same three companies.
Absolutely.
But when you do have those sort of next level down competitors, how do you compete with those?
I think it's more of what we're doing for it's the same competition that we're seeing for the others as well, right? Because if we're believing on that transparent, fair pricing with a cheap service that is fast and easy to use, that applies against any of our competitors, really. I guess the other thing as well to say is that we offer this stack not just as a public cloud, is that you're able to run our software and license our software in your own data center on your own hardware, connected to your own storage or something.
The customizations you mentioned.
Yeah, and that's another kind of SKU. CIVO Stack Enterprise is what we call it.
Okay.
But we're seeing a lot of people wanting to move away from cloud in general and bringing stuff back on-prem into their own data center, where they're able to touch and feel their own flashy lights, right? But you've got a generation now of infrastructure people that are used to deploying stuff in the cloud way, whether that's cloud native with Kubernetes or Terraform providers and ClickOps in AUI to just say, give me a VM, right? You talk to people about, here is a bit of hardware, and no, you can't infinitely scale the RAM because someone needs to go out, buy it, physically put RAM in a device to then allow you to provision a VM outside it.
You can infinitely scale it, it's just a bit slower.
Exactly. But it's more around getting these engineers to understand it. And doing things like placement groups and everything, right?
Just on the transparency side, something you mentioned a couple of times, I wanted to check, how does this factor into things like, okay, we want to move on, what are the termination terms, and also in terms of SLAs, how transparent and honest are you about failures and things like that as well?
Fully transparent about it, right? We're in an IT business, and to turn up and say we're never going to fail is just an outright lie. So what we want to be is always that company that when something goes wrong, we will tell you about it, and you will know about it, so that you don't have engineers debugging a problem that they can't fix. But on the flip side, we build that trust that if we don't say anything and you have a problem, you know that it's a problem in an application or in a service that you as a customer can fix, and you're not second guessing it. So that transparency is really, really, really key. And in terms of SLAs as well, we've got a really good SLA. It's not a compromised SLA or anything like that. So
and the termination is relatively short, I guess, or
if you want to leave, you want to go. I'm not gonna hold you to it. You're in an hourly billing cycle around it anyway. Go. There are no charges on egress. It's your data. You take it. You go. Hopefully, you tell us why. We want to improve and we want to get that feedback, but we're not going to hold you in if you don't want to be there.
I'd like to go back to what you were saying earlier about people moving back a little bit to on-prem. I have kind of a side question. I'm working on a piece for a European outlet. So obviously this question specific to European or Europe-based companies. And for many people, moving to cloud native is still something that you're still thinking about. But in terms of the developer space and kind of DevOps space, it's almost kind of sort of not in the past, but it's like, oh, yawn.
Yeah, of course we're going to do boring, standard.
What's next? What's new?
Yeah.
So would you say that what's next and what's new is almost actually kind of going back to what we did before, or is there something else as well?
No. When people are moving workloads from a cloud provider back to on-prem, they are still having to provide the same infrastructure and services and front end, which is why we're seeing a whole slew of people downstairs at KubeCon talking about IDPs. And developer platforms, right? Is because people are bringing these things on-prem, you're then having to build a cloud provider yourself for your internal developers to use.
Yeah. So do you think, I mean, that's not even necessarily a futuristic perspective. Let's move further.
Yeah.
What, complete like blue sky thinking. What do you think the future looks like for running and managing applications?
I think like WebAssembly as a technology is, in my opinion, still about 5 years out. There is some really interesting companies out there that are developing really interesting products, but it's almost like we have this shift of where compute cycles happen.
Yes.
If it is in a mainframe, it moves to a desktop, it moves back to a mainframe, then moves back to phones.
Yeah.
Now we're maybe seeing a shift back to server infrastructure with things like GPUs and power-hungry devices. But then we're seeing it probably move back to local devices with things like WebAssembly, allowing these write once, run everywhere, optimized coding infrastructures.
That's an interesting one. I also am quite interested in WebAssembly and have a whole bunch of content planned around it. But you put it in a very nice, sort of more discreet way about like why it's interesting. And is there, for a company like CIVO, if WebAssembly is the future, where do you sit in that?
So we're already supporting WebAssembly workloads on our Kubernetes, on our Kubernetes clusters. So normally you have to provision the underlying nodes and put different runtimes on it. As of today, we support, I think it's the Wasm Edge runtime and the Spin runtime are default installed onto our Kubernetes nodes. You just have to put a runtime class in it and push your workload onto it and it works. We've got marketplace applications for SpinCube that was announced kind of last week.
Is this the Fermion Spin?
Yeah.
Interesting. Okay.
So if you want to go downstairs and talk to them, you can get
several times.
You can get a demo of SpinCube running on a Kubernetes cluster, and it's now in our marketplace as well, which is a little one-click install.
Yeah, I didn't realize they were going on that kind of push. Actually, it's interesting to hear. Okay.
So we're there to look to support at least new technologies. We want to be staying up to speed with it and allowing customers to deploy that there.
And coming back a little from the far future, say KubeCon EU next year, what's on CIVO's roadmap for the next few months?
For the next few months, I think the opportunity around VMware is going to be pretty big.
Fill me in on that, because maybe I missed the announcement.
No, so in November last year, Broadcom acquired VMware. Okay. They have been announcing that they are wanting to, I don't know if it's 4 million or 4 billion annually, is their current revenue from VMware, that they want to double in 3 years. Right. So say it's 8 billion. They currently have, I think it's around 600,000 customers. They have said that they're going to drop that down to 1,000 customers. And if you try and do the maths around that, of how do you double your revenue and drop your customer base by 1,000, is you have to put your prices up.
This feels like a bad statement to put out, doesn't it?
Right.
So you think the future for you will be maybe picking up some of those people?
I think, in the short term, at least for the next 6 to 12 months, I can see that there's a lot of panic in that area. Our ability to have a managed enterprise-ready version of a public cloud deployed locally in your own data center, using your own hardware, and giving these customers the ability to use VMs like in a VMware way is going to be really interesting.
Yeah. What a strange statement to make. Anyway, more for people like you.
And it's all out there. It's all public. So did a talk at we run our own events as well. So we had one in Austin 3-4 weeks ago. That was a session.
South by Southwest? Or?
No, so CIVO Navigate is the event. We've run that. Austin was our third one that we've run. But there was a session, like a fireside chat that I did about the whole VMware thing. So the YouTube is on video. The video is on YouTube if you wanted to catch up. And I go into more details about these stats and everything.
And for people who are interested in trying CIVO, you mentioned the hourly billing, but is it like also anyone can sign up, or they have to speak to a sales team?
No,
or?
anyone can sign up. So you get $250 of credit to try out the service, see whether you like it. You should find it very similar to any other cloud provider you've ever used, but faster, cheaper, simpler.
Very good. All right, cool. Awesome.
Cool.
Thank you very much.
No worries.
What's your role with Open Infra?
So I'm the general manager at the Open Infra Foundation. Used to be the engineering director, then the VP of engineering, so more on the open source project management side. Yeah. But I took on more of a horizontal responsibility now across the whole organization.
I'm sure you get asked this question a lot. Cloud native, open infrastructure, what's the difference?
So it's pretty simple. If you think of the word cloud native, it assumes that you have a cloud and you have programmable resources, base computing, storage, and networking. And so cloud native is built on top of an existing cloud. So you can run it on top of AWS, you can run it on top of other clouds, you can also run it on top of OpenStack clouds. And what we care for is that area below Kubernetes. From Kubernetes to the Linux kernel, trying to have open source solution in that space, because typically you have hyperscalers, they all have their proprietary stacks. And we think that it's important that the rest of the world also has access to those technologies. So we started with OpenStack, which is an open source solution to provide cloud APIs like EC2 or S3. But we also expanded to other projects. It served the same space, like people who provide infrastructure for others to build applications on. So that's the layer we are at. It's obviously, I would say, a smaller audience. We don't target developers directly as much. We target the people whose responsibility is to run and provide that infrastructure. So either in private clouds within organizations, or running a public cloud based on OpenStack, like OVH here in France and others.
So it's smaller audience, but probably bigger footprint in some respects.
Well, and longer term investments as well. Like you basically make a bet on those technologies and invest a lot of hardware around it. You have to maintain it over time. So it's a bit of a different time scale as the cloud native community, where you use containers today. Tomorrow you could switch to WebAssembly or whatever, and so it's a much more boring in a way, like very slow, movements. But I think it's very important that there are open source solutions in that specific space. Otherwise, it's all the big companies are.
So actually, I mean, you mentioned OpenStack. Firstly, just for, if there's a secondary name for this event, which is Cloud Native Con, but a lot of things here are Kubernetes or Kubernetes adjacent. In the Open Infrastructure Foundation, a lot of things are around OpenStack. For people who don't really know what OpenStack is, what does it do and what's its history, briefly?
Yeah, so OpenStack started as back in 2010, back when there was basically only Amazon Web Services in the public cloud space. And there are several projects, open source projects, that were looking into providing an open source way of doing the same thing. And there was one called Eucalyptus, and that was written in Java, proposed by a single vendor company. But they had a pretty aggressive open core stance where they would reject improvements from their users, including NASA, which was trying to build a private cloud to run their own workloads. And so at the same time, Rackspace, which was at that time the number 2 size public cloud in the US, were looking into the next generation of their cloud storage technology and wanting to do it in open source to get more contributions from the rest of the community. And so those two projects were basically at the same time, and we managed to make them combine their efforts into providing a single openly developed across a range of organizations solution driven by a single company. And that's how we started OpenStack. You end up with, it's a collection of projects. It's not a single project. It's not like Kubernetes where you have a single repository and you deploy a single product. It's a collection of smaller projects, which each provide a certain API, a certain service. You have one that gives you VMs as a service. You have one that gives you Kubernetes clusters as a service, like provisioning Kubernetes clusters. There's one that gives you bare metal service, bare metal machines that you deploy whatever you want on. Like all of those things through hidden behind an API that gives you programmatic access to it. So it's complex. There are no two OpenStack deployments that look the same because it depends which of those components you actually deploy. And it's used in a lot of public clouds, especially in Europe and in Asia. It's used in a lot of private clouds. Like we've had CERN in the keynote at KubeCon today. They're actually running all of their Kubernetes installations on top of an OpenStack cloud. And it's the elephant in the room in a lot of those private deployments. You still need some software to handle the scale of your infrastructure and make those resources available to higher level tools like Kubernetes and others. And having that in a way that lets you consume VMs directly, consume Kubernetes cluster, consume other forms, bare metal machines, GPUs, all of those things, and is pretty necessary past a given scale. So yes, it's not something you would deploy in your own garage for your storage needs. It's probably a bit too complex for that, but for everyone who doesn't want to reinvent the wheel and has that kind of requirements and wants to do it internally, it's basically the only solution out there at this point.
If Kubernetes and OpenStack are so commonly found together, has there ever been, or is there any kind of effort to make, I don't know, Kubernetes more like OpenStack or OpenStack more like Kubernetes? Are they too different from each other, really?
Oh, they're not that different. Like in terms of community, we have this. It's basically the same. It's basically the same style of open governance. We communicated a lot with the initial Kubernetes leadership to help them shape the project in an open collaboration that is super accepting of a variety of contribution, making sure that they had the right basic principles in place to be successful. So in terms of governance, it's pretty similar. The programming languages are different, so obviously they're different there. We are using an open source based software forge. They're using GitHub. So there are like a number of differences. But we're still, since we're seeing so much, Kubernetes on OpenStack usage, basically I don't know if there is one OpenStack deployment that doesn't have some kind of Kubernetes on top of it. We realized that it would be good to explain that there is a solution that is end-to-end open source to provide infrastructure in a cloud-native way. And you start with Linux, combined with OpenStack and Kubernetes, gives you a full end-to-end open source solution for that space. And it's a standard that's Loki stack, L-O-K-I. It's a pattern that we've seen repeating over and over again. And that's what we are collaborating with the Kubernetes community, making sure that the two projects work well together. Like that Kubernetes can easily pool resources from an OpenStack cloud the same way they pool resources from hyperscaler clouds. And that's the idea.
In that Loki, you said, what's the I?
Infrastructure.
Oh,
so that the acronym is funnier than lock.
Okay. And it's just not that there's particularly many Kubernetes alternatives these days either, but what are some of the OpenStack alternatives in the proprietary and open source world? I mean, you mentioned Eucalyptus, I suppose, but were there any others? Or
most of the open source projects that were, there was an Apache Cloud Stack. I think it still has a few deployments. There is Open Nebula in Europe it's a vendor that has their single vendor open source solution for that space. They're pretty active in the, I would say, European circles, and I think they're all targeting slightly simpler cases where you will never build a public cloud based on those technologies. But you could totally build a decent private cloud with good resources. It's just that it's not meant to handle infinite scale or meant to serve the hyperscaler use case in the same way as OpenStack was built from the ground up. So in that space, I would say that's some of the competition there. in the open source area. In the proprietary area, obviously VMware still has a lot of market share in I would say what we call the pet workloads, like the virtual machines. You can either consider them as pets or
It's been a
cattle.
long time since I've heard that.
But VMware, there is a long tail of VMware workload that is running, it's been happily running the same application for the past 30 years, VM migrating from one server to another. And so the users of those workloads are used to a pretty good user experience in terms of, UI and the way they interact with those things. They are not necessarily ready to jump to, API driven consumption of resources and spinning up virtual machines using an API call. And so I feel like there's still some space for that kind of, more pet style VM management. And there's a bunch of solutions in the open source space and the proprietary space.
And so basically, unless someone rolls their own in a public cloud these days, it's probably OpenStack.
Yeah, if you approach it from a cloud native perspective, yes. Like if you want to have something that looks like what Amazon would give you, that's probably the only solution out there.
When we look out across the show floor or the talk schedule for a KubeCon, you see so many related projects that adding things on top of Kubernetes or connecting to Kubernetes. They're not always directly part of it, but they kind of connect in and out of it. If I was to look at an Open Infra event and I looked out across the show floor, are there similar things? Is there a similar ecosystem around OpenStack for additions, services, SaaS companies, et cetera, et cetera?
I would say it's slightly more difficult to differentiate and monetize on top of OpenStack. You can obviously provide the main use case is to provide infrastructure for others. So you can do that for a fee as a public cloud, but beyond that, Kubernetes has a bit won the upper layer, and there aren't that many alternative.
No, I remember
solutions.
some of them, but yes.
So I feel like we'll see a revival of that with the VMware situation right now. The Broadcom acquisition resulted in invoices that are like 10 times more expensive than previous. And so there is a space that for building solutions that would use OpenStack as the engine, but would give you an interface that looks a lot more like what you're used to as a VMware user, because they are looking for solutions. They want an out to the situation they're in, and so they're all looking for solutions. And if there is no solution right now, that means there is an opportunity for an ecosystem.
Actually, that's actually a very interesting point. They talk a lot to people about what's the plans for the next 6 to 12 months. Bizarrely, they've given a lot of people an opportunity to fill, and a fairly large one.
I see the AI craze as another way to trigger new opportunities in the OpenStack ecosystem, as there's a lot of new requirements on infrastructure. It's very difficult to buy GPUs right now. How do you get most out of them? How do you share them really? And so there's probably opportunities for like new projects in the open source space to be created around that specific need, but also potentially differentiation and monetization for the people that will be able to do that better than others. And we're already seeing like one of I think the number 2 buyer of GPUs is an OpenStack based public cloud that is specialized in GPUs. And so we're seeing commerce as well, very specialized in those specific workloads. So I think like that's what we would see, but that doesn't feel a room like the one you have below us.
So on the other side of that, here is so many talks on, and I suppose because Kubernetes crosses a lot more into the user space, not just implementation details of Kubernetes and implementing Kubernetes, but things you're running on Kubernetes, payloads, workloads, etc. At an Open Infra event, what kind of talks would someone expect to see?
Yeah, so here you have a duality between, you have 2 types of talks. People that are deploying applications on top of existing Kubernetes infrastructure, and people whose role it is to actually spin up those services. And it's always been like something you would have two types of things. Some day it's one day keynote, the other day is the next day. It's more the end users. And whereas at an open infra event, you would mostly have people that provide infrastructure.
Yeah.
You will have in shiny use cases. Obviously, it's always nice to show a user, but it's usually in the scope of we deploy that infrastructure and we are using it for example, like doing weather predictions. The European Agency for Meteorology is
particles.
Smashing particles, and like it's always more. It makes a better show if you also show the users at some point. But I would say the main audience is really about people that have the same kind of problems. I need to upgrade my infrastructure really regularly. How do we make that simpler? I need to buy new servers. What's the thing I should be buying today? So we see hardware vendors a bit more than here. We see the provider of resources, the network card vendors. Like there's a gradient from hardware to the people that provide solutions to run on OpenStack.
In the next sort of 12 months, what's on? Roadmap isn't the right word for foundation, but what's the kind of the organizational plan for the next 12 months?
So we haven't talked a lot about Kata Containers, which is our project that is in this specific space. Basically, it's a container runtime that is secure, combines the security of lightweight VMs with I would say the form factor of containers. And we're seeing a lot of demand for, I would say, like, for example, Microsoft Azure has been deploying it to do confidential containers inside their Azure Container Service. So we are seeing a lot of, I would say, realization that today, it should be secure by default instead of pretty insecure by default and relatively easy to escape the contained application. And so we are working this year to make sure that, I would say, we establish Kata Containers as a de facto. It should be the default way of running containers. It is the de facto way of running secure container workloads today, but we want to push more so that it's considered almost by default.
Is it a runtime or a standard? Or
it's a container runtime.
Okay, so it replaces
runc,
container
the container D. It runs. It's one option below container D, but it replaces the runc part. But it's a drop-in replacement. You don't have to change anything. It's just like switch and say, you want more security. There is a very small performance penalty to that, and I feel like it should be more well known.
Yeah, I'm about to actually do a roundup of container runtimes, and I've heard of it, but I didn't think that's what it was, strangely. So.
It's interesting because it solves the problem from different angles. So the traditional container isolation problem, which is around multi-tenancy, and how do you make sure that one container cannot escape and contaminate the other containers that are running on the same machine. But it also takes the perspective of protecting the container itself from the host, which is the confidential computing stuff. And that's actually what makes it super interesting for public cloud providers, especially the hyperscalers in the US. I want to prove that they actually can't access your workload. And so that gives them a way to do that. And that's what really drives a lot of adoption for Kata Containers. It's turning more into almost like a hub for those type of technologies.
I think that's where we counted it.
So it's integrating various kind of container isolation technologies under a convenient package. And yes, it's difficult to, for a project that is not Kubernetes to get, massive visibility here, because there are so many projects and so many companies vying for attention. And so we're trying to bring it to the forefront, and because I feel like it should be useful.
Maybe you need to have a project exchange with the CNCF.
and to answer more directly your question around events, we are having an OpenStack Summit in Asia, in South Korea in September. So that's the other big.
Interesting. I mean, that's actually something, I think before the lockdowns around the world, one thing I used to see at a lot of cloud native events was a lot of the Asian public clouds. Huawei, Alibaba, even, those were the main two, had booths and presences, and that's kind of gone the past couple of years, but they're still there and they're still huge.
And feels like it's where the momentum is for open infra right now. It's Europe and Asia, because in the US, I would say the hyperscalers have
The deal's been done.
I mean, yeah, they're running unimpeded.
Yeah.
And so we're trying to collaborate with them so that they open source as much as what they're using, or they collaborate on.
CIVO yesterday was another kind of slightly smaller one, but yeah.
Yeah, and I feel like there's still a lot of potential for them to use Kata containers, for example, or to collaborate on common pieces that would make them more interoperable. Like, there's some potential there, but it's true that with the digital sovereignty aspect, it's Europe and Asia are much more into
keeping things,
creating new things, like creating new providers.
Yeah. Interesting. Okay. And blue sky, as far into the future as you want to look, thinking, for many companies, although, your projects exist at a sort of lower level, so even no matter what changes, they'll probably still be using your provided software anyway. But for many companies, cloud native is still quite new. There's still many in a transition to it, or in it, starting that transition. But to a lot of developers and DevOps people, it's almost kind of like, cloud native. Again, what's the next thing?
Yeah.
So, after cloud native is kind of boring and dumb, and we have a new way of deploying, managing, running applications, what do you think that will be?
That's a good.
Go as wild as you think.
Yeah, that's a good question. Like, it's interesting because I feel like there are new form factors for application deployment. Like we mentioned WebAssembly earlier. WebAssembly, microkernels. I feel like the container as the unit of computing that's going to change. Like there is going to be at least a variety of options. People realize that VMs are still better at a number of things, that WebAssembly is better at some other things. So it's going to eat a bit at the container thing. I'm not sure that will end the cloud native.
No, I'm
like
putting a provocative question.
It's just that the idea that you build your application on top of someone that provides you infrastructure is going to stay. Like I feel like that this new division within companies between people that are the platform people that provide you that very agnostic infrastructure versus the users, that's going to continue. And so the term cloud native, if you disconnect it from containers, it's going to continue. The trick for cloud native, I think, is going to be, how do you navigate an ecosystem that's extremely Kubernetes centric into something that might be, the fact that you consume cloud in a cloud native way, it doesn't have to be, it's not Kubernetes foundation, it's cloud native. So how do you negotiate that? That turn is going to be interesting. I feel like the Kubernetes community has gone a bit too far away into trying to make Kubernetes the solution to everything, like through addition of operators and new things. At one point, it's not going to be the perfect fit for that kind of workload. They are trying, like WebAssembly, we've seen in the keynote today, something that lets you run WebAssembly workloads within Kubernetes. Doesn't mean it's the right way of doing it. And so it's going to be interesting how the fact that this community is so centered around Kubernetes, it's the only rock around which all the other boats are turning. Well, I see cloud native easier to say. I'm not sure the cube aspect is going to be forever. Okay. There is a lot of complexity to it. People are a bit fed up. But people wish for platform as a service type solutions again, where one of the best practices that Kubernetes allows you to build is abstracted away from them. And so that's going to be...
Just one thing I wonder, I'm not sure if because of the focus on OpenStack being very much more the kind of larger scale operator, I'm not sure if this is something you would have seen so much, but one other thing a few people mentioned to me, apart from WebAssembly, was seeing a trend of some companies moving their clouds, whether it becomes a cloud anymore, back in-house. I don't know if that
repatriation.
Yeah. Is that something, I mean, if people do that, would they use OpenStack anyway? Is it probably not necessary?
So we've seen a few like high-profile case of, very, very loudly claiming we're leaving AWS and we're going back inside. when you do that in such a visible way, it's usually that you're negotiating payment terms. What we're seeing though is the people that have been having more of a mixed strategy where they deploy private infrastructure for their base workloads and use the hybrid spikes. They burst out on the public cloud for their thing. They're all increasing their OpenStack footprint. So they're all realizing that, it's very costly to run things in the public cloud. It's good for handling unexpected workloads. But if you have something that's pretty basic, basic and stable, running that over on Amazon Web Services, for example, it's like paying, I can't remember, there was this streaming company, I don't want to name names, that
I think I saw it.
gave them very high percentage of their revenue just to be able to operate. So Amazon doesn't even have to buy them. They basically own them already. And so there is this, I would say, the realization that, financially it's not sustainable. And so people are usually not necessarily repatriating, but they're trying to build infrastructure for if they have base workloads and can afford it. And it's good to see.
Cool. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you.
And those are my interviews with Dinesh from CIVO and Thierry from the Open Infrastructure Foundation. All right, a few small updates from me. I'm working on a lot of big video content at the moment, but in the meantime, by the time this is released, there will be a couple of short videos out there. I'm experimenting with a few short videos across Instagram, YouTube, and TikTok. I have some Ableton quick tips, and I will have another spoken word flash fiction reading initially on TikTok and then to other channels a bit later. So head on over to christianschiller.com to find all the links for those outlets and see what you think. The flash fiction reading especially includes some music I made with my collaborator James Harding. Actually, so does the Ableton quick tip, but that was music I made on my own. Episode 6 of a new podcast I have been working on with Mustafa Keskin is out. Whiskey, Words and Wit. I haven't really spoken about it because we've been sort of ironing out the format, and now I think we've sort of got it down. And also, you can head on over to christianschiller.com because I did a lot of overhauling to certain sections. The podcast pages are now split into the 2 different shows, and I'll add some more older shows and appearances on other people's shows to that soon. But you can kind of jump between an overall feed and the 2 different show feeds. On the blog section, I also added tags, so you can start to filter down some of the blogs I've written over the years. I will add some search and filter to those overall at a later stage, but getting the bits in place for that, and that's taken me a little bit of a while to work on, so I'm pleased that's finally released. In terms of outside of the digital world, it is We Are Developers in Berlin next week. I will be there. I'm interviewing a few people, meeting a few people. There's also a warm-up side event as part of Write the Docs in Berlin on the Wednesday that I will be speaking at if you happen to be in town. And finally, also, if you live in Berlin, I am doing sound and lights for an English version of a Spanish play called The House of Bernarda Alba. I will put a link in the show notes if you want to come along. It's an all-female cast. I'm the only man in the entire production, and you won't even see me, so that's good. I'll be in the booth at the back. And come along. We have evening shows and matinees towards the end of July. That's it for now. More interviews in 2 weeks, and next week is a news and links show. So I have been Christian Schiller. Thank you very much for joining me, and take care, everybody. I hope you enjoyed the show. Find out more about me at christianschiller.com, where you can find show notes, sign up for my newsletter, and find all of my writing, games, work, and video links. There's also details on how to get in touch with me. And if you want to get even closer to what I do, join my Discord server for behind-the-scenes discussions, helping me produce my shows and